Jessica Becker, and you're listening to Human Powered Podcast. I'm here with my co-host Jen Rubin,
Hello, everyone.
who was a producer of Love Wisconsin Stories, and the person we're talking to today actually was featured as a Love Wisconsin story. Adam Carr is with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, that's not how we got to know you exactly, though, I don't think, Adam. We
Oh,
started working together. We worked together on a lot of fun projects, and very specifically, Human Powered. Actually, you co-hosted with Dasha Kelly Hamilton. That was a good
what?
time. Yeah.
Absolutely. I was just reflecting on it this morning, preparing for this podcast, and I was thinking about how it changed my life. So thank you guys for being part of that collaboration.
Absolutely. So, plug here if you haven't listened to that's season two, Humanities Unlocked. Um, so, Adam, we also know you through your work as a public historian, and you've done a lot in Milwaukee, and you were helpful in training some of our community-powered fellows when they did their trainings to learn about techniques for community engagement that bring
Mm,
people together. So one of the things we were going to ask you about is your work as a public historian, because I think that word, what does that even mean?
yeah, that's a great question. So I don't like introducing myself with titles because I have had a very wandering career on purpose. And public historian, community historian has been something that really honestly found me. My first real adult job out of college was at Radio Milwaukee, and it was a radio station that allowed me to, as the producer there, to explore stories in my city. And what I found is the history of my city had never been available to me, but I'd been swaddled in it my whole life. Once I started to be able to get into the act of dissecting and excavating what I saw in front of me, gaining kind of a literacy, not for what people were telling me and what I was seeing, but rather being able to dwell in places and get deeper in them. I found history, and especially community and public history, was everywhere, and it ignited me personally. But what I found is, historians have this idea of the great man fallacy, that history was created by these big people doing big things, and I found the world around me was shaped by common brilliance, and especially being from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and being, yeah, both of those places, Milwaukee and Wisconsin. Um, I say with all humility that humility is our superpower. And I think getting get to stumbling through that door and having a microphone, I'm talking into like one of the microphones I used to use right now, and then getting to put that in front of other people. That to me, that's drinking from the Holy Grail, like when someone really can open up and we're there together communing with each other. So, yeah, I got lucky, got a job in 2008 at Radio Milwaukee. They gave me a microphone and a broadcast signal, and then now I'm still doing that, I guess.
Yeah, one thing what you're saying reminded me because another thing that we did when I was producing Love Wisconsin is had a chance to interview to do a feature of you there. And so one thing you just said about like you like to dwell in a place and get deeper into a place. And another thing that I remember you saying in the interview is like you were sort of raised in the abundance of Milwaukee,
Mm,
right? And so I think for me, the thing that I so appreciate about how you went about your public historian walks or just, what you brought to these interviewing, right, is just this like deep appreciation of the abundance that's around you, and like, because you live in a city that I think people who are not from that city don't think of as an abundant city, right? Like, I would just love to hear you talk about some of that, like what you've learned as
absolutely.
a researcher and historian about Milwaukee.
Oh my God, what a great question. I did grow up in the abundance of the city, but I didn't know the word abundance. I grew up going to great public schools here. I grew up on the east side, just a couple blocks from Lake Michigan. Really lucky kid. In the era of busing in Milwaukee, where a city deeply segregated and divided, there's this time where the workaround was to say, well, let's get kids from different places in schools together. And I went to phenomenal public schools here, which, so when I say the abundance of the city, the human abundance is what I was raised in. And when I say that abundance, let's stay in kind of a gardening metaphor. Like the harvest wasn't all, it was sweet, but it wasn't always neat. I grew up in, I would say, loud, boisterous, collision-rich environments. I loved it. And it was also hard. It challenged me to not just build armor, but think about what was beneath it. So, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in my adulthood, as I've discovered what that abundance really means is I've been thinking a lot of, I loved inorganic chemistry in high school because I'm a nerd. And there's this thing that led to inorganic chemistry, which is, something you do in a lab and very sciencey, which is alchemy. There are alchemists everywhere around Milwaukee. And to me, in this moment, Milwaukee is a hive of alchemists. But here's the thing, in the same way I didn't know the word abundance growing up, we don't always know that we are alchemists. So, am I being too weird? Is this making sense? This is how I think about my hometown. So you asked me
I
this
think you're being
question,
just weird. You're being just weird
and
enough, Adam. So
cool,
yeah, go
thank
ahead.
you. This is a podcast, right? So cool. Whoever's listening, this is for you only. Um, and but no, and then to speak about the abundance then, and we're talking about humanities in the context of 2025 and the work I've done as a public historian. So here's what I really mean by all that. I think sometimes I think of Milwaukee as a perfect microcosm of the American macrocosm. And I talk to folks in other places who have more opportunity or less, and I say, that's not quite America. My folks on the East Coast are like, why are you struggling with that? And I was like, why aren't you? All of us are. And similarly, I'll be in spaces that Milwaukee can have this it's challenging here. So sometimes I say the ceiling is low, but the floor is high. If you put in the energy, the place will find you. And as a public historian, what that means is I find amazing stories when I look at the human scale. And when I have to, and that's been actually since the inauguration, I've been really challenging myself to think about my own human scale, and what is possible within the parameters of my own humanity. When I frame my neighbor that way, I think America is possible in Milwaukee. I live in the south side of the city, which has always been an immigrant neighborhood as long as Milwaukee's been a city. And when I walk down the sidewalk and when I move through the alley, we had someone picked up by ICE 3 blocks from my house. It's scary. It's not a moment in which, um, when I reach for the courage, it always comes. But if it were not for the existence of this place, or that this place exists and it's been through the ringer. So I know that this moment, is one that's going to challenge us immensely, but I also think the alchemists will be up to the task. I have a 4-year-old daughter. I have no choice but to think that way, even when it feels dark. So,
So hearing you talk about your city reminds me of when I got to go on a tour where you were
mm,
the guide, leading folks and on the street, a walking tour of Milwaukee. And we went to a market and you bought some bread and brought the bread out
yeah,
and talked to us about the baker and the bakery and the history of that place and that person. And you told the story through that bread and we peeled the bread apart. Do you want to talk about how you share stories with people on the
yeah.
ground?
Thank you for that. Yeah, that was really I'm proud of that moment. Thank you for bringing that up. We were downtown and there was a bakery that had been popping around Milwaukee. This happens. It was named Amano, and Amano is actually no longer around. I just, I'd seen him selling his ware. This guy, let me think of him, Edgar. He was just selling bread that he had bread in his family, and he got into baking, and he started baking around town. The thing you say is breaking bread. So we had the opportunity to do this tour. there was this bread with this beautiful story. We broke the bread up, and I mean, just with my hands. I mean, you guys signed the waiver by being interested in humanities. Um, and we ate bread together as a way of putting us into a shared experience. And in that way, the whole experience of a walking tour is a shared experience, but that one being beginning in your mouth, actually, or beginning in your hand, going into your mouth and down into your body. Um, for me, when I'm doing my job well, I feel like I'm not using my head. I'm using my head, my heart, and my stomach. And I feel like sometimes I want to start from the stomach, actually, and like if we're going around and trying to like digest a place. So, you know, the city feels like my instrument, and I love to play it.
I think, Adam, when I think about like the work you've done, particularly like the work you've done with Wisconsin Humanities, the work you've done in Milwaukee, like it's such a like a unique sort of specific thing, right? And so we're in this moment in time where, federal government is like further chopping away our public institutions, right? And so, but there are all these people like you who are outside these public institutions, but are doing this really impactful work of like helping us all understand what we see around ourselves, right? And so, how are you able to navigate in this moment?
That's a great question. So I recently, I've been working for 2.5 years, a job at the Milwaukee Parks Foundation, and recently transitioned back into doing independent work. And I'd been doing independent work for 11 years before that. And as you mentioned, did a lot of history, public history in many forms, so tours, but also I'd done, public art projects, including, NEA funded work at a library. I'd done filmmaking, which included other work funded from, sources that have been cut, including the Wisconsin Humanities Council. Some of the grant that we got, is currently in hibernation. And, I've done facilitation and organizing work. So the reason I mention that is I feel like I've been able to do through my work in Milwaukee, I've been kind of like a pollinator through many gardens. And I've been exploring getting back into independent work. I've been checking out the gardens again. So what I've been able to do is kind of survey the wreckage a little bit. Um, the cuts from Doge, I mean, a lot of my peers and a lot of my collaborators and other folks, they don't have day jobs that were funded through federal sources, but a tremendous amount of community work is adjacent to those things.
Mhm.
So while I never even had visibility on it all the time as my growing my career, if someone's going to pay me, they pay me. I don't say, is that coming from a National Science Foundation grant? Is that coming from Department of Education? Is that humanities related? Like whatever. And in retrospect, a lot of it was. So just in the past 3 months or so, I've had multiple people email me saying, I was planning to offer you money to do something this summer in collaboration. I can no longer do that because we lost a grant from one federal source or another. And then to the other piece that aside from just the impact that like you understand this, like in your house, if you lose one income stream, it's not just gonna impact one part of your life, it's gonna ripple outwards, right? Like if, like a leaky roof means a bunch of bad stuff happens beyond just the roof. And the roof is already leaking, the instability that it's caused. So there's organizations that are, making rash decisions. There's just been a lot of destabilizing that has happened outside of just groups that are no longer receiving checks from the government. It's making its way down in so many different ways, and the vibrations of it um, are incredibly destabilizing. I have never felt like a lot of the conventional institutional solutions or ways of thinking, even coming from the progressive side, were up to the challenge. And I think
Mm.
this is a moment to be really introspective and not to look at each other and yell, and not to look at each other and be bratty about it and say, I was right and you were wrong, especially for those who have been kind of working on the margins, or who have made our home away from the institutional centers. I think it's an important time to find reciprocity, to build relationships, and also to really ask ourselves the question, um, if our prevailing logic models were producing an inadequate result and now it's being attacked, how do we use that as a moment to build back stronger? But before we start building, to say, not just as build the house again, what do we need for ourselves now? To me, it's not a question of how do we get back in power. It's how do we find the power we weren't allowing ourselves to claim. That sounded good. I like
Yeah. Well,
that.
one thing you said, you were talking about the like, as things have completely fallen apart, like how do we dream what we want as we build back better? And I know one thing that I always think about is, back in the 1930s when we had the WPA, like when you think about the
Mm,
humanities, like writers were federal workers, right? Like there's incredible books where they go into a city and they just like, if you read the books about New York or any city, like it's like this complete telling of the city, what it was like then, right? Like this idea that these were essential public workers, the people who are visually, verbally, whatever, telling the stories of our city to help us understand who we are and where we are, right? And so, like, I am definitely a cup. Like I'm always waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'm not an optimistic person, but like if somehow if we climb out of this, we build back to this time where we understood, you know, this mattered.
And I think that's an interesting moment to bring up the establishment of the National Endowment for the Humanities came out of a period when there was also a recognition looking at American history and saying, oh my gosh, we just got through, World War I, World War II. We've seen fascist dictatorships. We understand the role that history and culture and the arts play in developing a national culture and identity. We recognize the
yeah,
value, and we understand also that this is what makes a complete and whole human. And we're going to invest in having educated citizenry that understands how to talk to each other and understands how to come together to talk through difficult issues that are
yeah,
coming up. And so they invested in that infrastructure. And that's where you get the NEH and the NEA. And then they said, well, hey, and it works better to state level because all the states are different. And we want to invest in the states to respond to the real needs of people. And that's where you get the state councils like Wisconsin Humanities. And so, yeah, I
yeah,
mean, it's not wrong to also look at other programs like WPA where those investments had huge
yeah.
lasting impacts. And now we're seeing how de-investment is also going to have huge and lasting impacts for generations. For generations, people are going to be suffering the chaos of this destabilization and the losses that come with it.
I, yes, that is definitely when I look to the horizon, part of what I'm seeing. And I love what you guys said about WPA and just, National Endowment for Humanities. So I mentioned it before, what I'll be doing later today is going to this Teachers Institute. I'm going to the Sherman Phoenix, and working with some teachers. I'm going to be sharing the story of the Sherman Phoenix, which was created in Milwaukee after Officer Dominique Hagan Brown shot and killed Sybil Smith. This was 9 years ago in the Sherman Park neighborhood. And while we're there, what we'll be discussing is the Teacher Institute is really this project based around civics and history. And we looked at movement history as a way of conveying to students what it means to participate in democracy. So civics. And what you said, Jen, and what you said, Jessica, those governmental programs in a time when America was a more centralized idea, cultivated in its citizenry a sense of, that kind of I have a friend who calls that kind of like the soft tissue of, American life or of civic life. And so that program, we just got a letter from the Department of Education that let us know. I'm going to read it to you because I want to make sure I get it right. They've undertaken a review of grants and determined the grant specified provides funding for programs that reflect the prior administration's priorities and policy preferences and conflict with the current administration. We are Our programs either violate the letter or purpose of federal civil rights law, conflict with the department's policy of prioritizing merit, fairness, and excellence in education, undermine the well-being of the students these programs are intended to help, or constitute an inappropriate use of federal funds. I would love Department of Education to come visit me when I'm working with students in a classroom, and come with me on a walking tour. I got to work with students from Bradley Tech High School throughout the school year, inviting them into their neighborhood, into experiences that were being systematically withheld from them from the world around them. And in doing so, I could see seeds planted in their minds of what the world could be and how they could participate in it. And I'm not saying that this is something I do and I know I'm good at, but getting students into the world, but also getting students to engage in the world around them in their own humanity. Um, let me cross over to the podcast we made together. It was about humanities work in the carceral system. And if I could boil that all down, the big nugget I got from it and what it changed in my life, these were human beings being institutionalized on a daily basis. And you can see their institutionalization, people in the prison system or carceral system. The institutionalization literally means for them, you are on a schedule, you are being told who you are and what you are, and it is stripping you of everything but the fundamental thing of your body, which is your humanity. Your humanity is being stripped away into and what we then saw were these incredible, indestructible pockets of how people preserve their own humanity and only did so by communing with those around them, engaging in themselves and others. That to me, how incredible people were able to resist institutionalization in the carceral system. But here's my point though, like in this moment, it's more critical than ever that we don't look outside of ourselves and say they're the ones dehumanizing us. Because there's a lot of ways in which we're complicit internally, inside of ourselves. And even, I'll just say it because I know who's probably listening to this podcast, myself included, even in progressive communities, it's a softer institutionalization. So here's my point. I think technology plays a really huge role in that, the algorithms that are kind of constantly guiding us into what we think. So the way I think out of institutionalization is critical thinking. That's the way we earn a place in the future. That's the way humanity makes it to the future. That's the way my daughter will be able to be 80 someday in something other than a hinterland.
It
And so,
also explains why these cuts are happening, right? But the hopeful side of it, as you say, is that it's inherent in us. It is who we are as humans. So that's the hopeful piece, right? Because it's accessible. It's there for us.
yeah.
Um, and that is it's our gift as humans. That's why the word humanity is what it is. It's who we are.
The way in which human beings have been able to become what we've become is solely through the ability to bond with each other and also explore the outer reaches of inner space. Relationships are more important than ever before. Like, Doge is never going to eviscerate my relationships.
And yeah, I'm hearing humanities people like yourself, people who are doing this work in communities talking about the value of relationships.
I'm not surprised relationships have come up in your podcast conversations. That's also true when I say building relationships, especially everyone hears that I've been talking to as well. Because that's in part to say, having faith that the resource landscape will shift in return. That's where you want to be, right? Not isolated. But here's the other, I feel like really, we actually, as much as we've worked together, the podcast that we created was during the pandemic.
Mhm.
And another thing that comes up in every conversation I have just a little bit is how the cultural context shifted through the pandemic to make 2025 such a vulnerable time. And just thinking about how we're talking on Zoom right now, it's opened up these like incredible possibilities, but I think it's also shaped our relational paradigms and how we think of what relationships can be. And it's oftentimes narrowed them because just on the relationships in the work we're talking about, oftentimes are the basis of collaboration, right? Like we know each other, so work. But if I don't know the full scope of who you are and what you do, that can narrow the collaboration and actually sour what is possible, or not sour,
Yeah.
but limit and
Yeah.
eventually sour. So my point being, I think moving back into human relationships as opposed to digital ones. I've seen that happen in the world. We're not solely trapped in that paradigm, but I think we're still trying to break free from it about like what the possibility of a relationship, what that even means. It's not just
Yeah.
like, I know your CV or I follow you on social media and think you're cool. Like that's a lot of times what people think relationships are in this current moment, but like that full spectrum of relationship and finding fuller ways of being in relationship to each other that like yeah, a bunch of money disappearing from the government should destroy a lot, but it doesn't destroy. doesn't it wasn't the Death Star destroying Tatooine. It
Yeah.
was the stormtroopers are around and I'm an Ewok. And I think though what I found though from the humanities work that I've done and actually being able to be in relationship with communities is that creative, artistic, intellectual production is native to the human experience and it exists whether you have the resources and money to render the creativity, the art, the culture at the scale you want it to or not. So what I mean though is like in a lot of communities where resources are modest, people get super creative. And so there is, it's like the recipes and the ingredients for culture making, for intellectual production, for humanities are present in every community. And I think what the funds allow for is people to render that at the scale, it scales beyond, the inadequate oftentimes, or
Yeah.
the small. And I do think, the subtle forces, the whispers of the universe, we need to tune into those because the laser beams aren't working anymore. So
Yeah.
I think like small, like yeah, like even just saying, I've heard people say any small act of humanity, and I think those small acts of humanities in our grassroots spaces, in our organizational spaces, in our institutional spaces feel more important than ever. And because I think a lot of
Yeah.
times, even a lot of our institutional logics have removed humanities from them. So I don't know.
Yeah, I actually I sort of appreciate that personally because I think as you both know, like so I'm on this super like weird, obscure, Midwest bagel quest, and I feel like every day
Not obscure
that
anymore. You're becoming
yeah,
you're blowing up in the
I'm blowing up. Yeah, yeah. But like every day it's this thing is like I have to sort of convince myself like, no, these kinds of storytelling, storytelling matter, right? Because right now, like this country, the news cycle, it's so crushing and it makes you feel like nothing you want to create matters, right? And so to kind of like remember that, not to sort of put my personal thing in sort of like a large context, but just it's
yeah,
it's I think it's a daily challenge for all of us to remind ourselves that our creative instincts matter, our storytelling matters, Anyway,
absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, and you told this story about your daughter and your daughter's sort of mutual aid community and getting together to craft and knit. I just organized a series of events over the past weekend called Field to Frock that was specifically looking at the history and of textile production, human
Cool.
history of textile production, and so that makes it sound complicated, but yeah, it's a very sophisticated technology, and the future of that in here in the Midwest. And one of the events that was really underplayed. We got a lot of wonderful press and we got tons of attention and attendance was amazing. And I didn't even really think much of this one mending event. And it was packed.
Mm,
People were turned out to learn mending.
that's
I was
cool.
just thinking about mending. Really, I was. I remember like the band T-Rex, that song, Bang a Gong. I read it like a critique of it that was like, this is celebrating the disposability of American culture. And I was like, well, it's a really good guitar lick and it's very catchy. But though, like the disposability of American culture, that was 50 years ago. I mean, we're deep
Right.
into the like, and that
Yeah,
wasn't the
yeah.
beginning of it. So the idea of mending, though, there's this sort of like fragility that has come from this disposability, like kind of reflex that we have. So mending with your socks, like with your pants, and not just being like, oh yeah, I can buy another one.
So Adam, I'm gonna actually try to build like a rickety bridge to the end of the conversation. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking that a good way to do this is for you to think of like whether who was your first interview or favorite interview and somehow just like steer it to the end of the episode. So
First interview is hard. Because, my first professional interview, I was actually working with another person's interviews before I went and interviewed myself. And I want to give props to my mom and dad actually, because for me as an interviewer, I feel like how I do it. My dad was a forager. He loved the world. He was a lawyer, and when I'd go visit him at work, we'd go have lunch, and he knew every guy in the kitchen. He was on first name basis with everyone, and my dad just he loved to be in the scrum of existence. So for me as an interviewer, to get in there. not be afraid, to know, and not to view everyone else's humanity as an invitation, but to know that it can exist. That was a gift from my father. My mother, as an art therapist, she got her master's at Mount Mary early on in their art therapy program, and then opened an art studio at named Dreamtime at DanceWorks. And there, I was making masks to express who I truly was. I was free drawing. I was in these, so I was able to find a connection to my own self and my own instincts, my own rhythms. And I think for me, the balance between those two, the forager and the gardener. For me, though, like the act of interviewing is at its best um, an act of communion. And that to me, though, yeah, that's what I want to say. My first
Mm.
interview, I guess, might have been. I mean, I was prepared to be an interviewer by the gifts of my parents. Maybe that's something we can all look at right now too, is not what's being taken away, but the incredible gifts we've been given. Because I guarantee you, anyone listening to this podcast has been given a lot of incredible gifts, and I think those
Yeah.
are the ones that we need to not just say are ours, but how we share those with the world. And
I really like that, Adam, because I feel like, well, did I just stop you from saying something important? Okay.
no, I just like everything's a sermon for me. So
Well, the reason why I just sort of like that, and maybe it's just for my own personal like motivational talk, which is like, right, like what are you good at? What can you do? Maybe it's just on your block, but that's what we have right now. Like this is a time to dig in locally. Let's go.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that will be my closing thought. I had a loving mentor of mine. I talked to him in February and I just asked him what his read was, and he said, "It's fallen apart, and you may feel the need right now to convince people. It is time to vibrate with the people that you vibrate with. And not that people won't see it and won't be convinced. It's probably the vibrations that'll get them there. So connecting to our own vibrations and those of the people who we vibrate with in this moment, um, that's the imperative I'm taking. And that's how I'm answering the question, what am I situated in this world to do right now? What am I uniquely situated to do in this world right now? Not just what do I want to do, not just where am I drawn. That does require slowing down. So I think I'm trying to vibrate a little slower actually, before I start vibrating all over the state.
Good.
Thank you.
If
Good
you're out there and
ending.
you're listening, we can vibrate together.
Thank you, Adam, for
Yeah,
giving
thank you
us.
guys.
This is exactly why I said yes to this idea to do the podcast, is to get to have conversations like this. So thank you.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
Jessica, so talking with Adam, we got real profound real quick, and I really sort of enjoyed where the conversation went.
Yeah, that was a good time. I had said to Adam in our email exchange, inviting him to join us, bring a cup of coffee and let's act like we're just sitting around together, over coffee, having a good conversation. And it really did feel like that. I enjoyed it.
I think, if you haven't yet listened to season 2 of our podcast, Human Power Podcast, I think we've referenced it. The season's called Humanity Unlocked. Adam and Dasha Kelly Hamilton are the co-hosts, and he really brings that just curiosity and the what's the word he used, like just sort of seeing the full humanity and everyone to a series at looking at people who are trying to find their humanity within mass incarceration. And it's every time I listen to it, I find myself jotting down something that he said, in his conversation with Dasha. So I encourage you to listen to that.
And thanks for being here. We will be back in a couple of weeks, and we really appreciate you listening. If you have thoughts about who we should talk to and what's going on in your community, get in touch with Wisconsin Humanities.
And thanks to Chrissy Widmeyer, who does our editing for us.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good one.